The year was 1957, and Olga Nettie-Kopensik was about to leave her home in Vancouver, Canada, and make the 1,400-mile trip south to the west coast of the United States. Carefully folding her clean white uniforms into her suitcase, the 29-year-old surgical nurse felt thrilled just thinking about the new job that awaited her at Cottage Hospital in Santa Barbara. Because for Olga, getting this job was a dream come true. Ever since Olga could remember, from the time she was a teenager growing up in the tiny town of Benito, Manitoba, one of Canada's western provinces, she had wanted to do something meaningful with her life, something that would help people in practical ways. And after graduating from high school and working in a doctor's office, Olga had decided what that something was. She wanted to become a nurse. So, 6 years earlier, back in 1951, Olga took the plunge. She had packed up these very same bags that she was using again now and headed to the highly regarded nursing school at British Columbia's General Hospital in Vancouver. It had been a trip of 1,200 miles, almost as long as the journey she'd be making the next day when she left for California. Even all these years later, she still remembered how homesick she felt after leaving Benito. She remembered waving goodbye to her parents and her younger brother and sister, and seeing her father, who had worked for 34 years as a foreman for the National Canadian Railroads, look so proud and so sad as she climbed onto the train that would take her off to school. And now, as Olga thought about all the additional miles she'd be putting between herself and her family with this move to California, she suddenly felt a fresh wave of that same homesickness. But Olga was not someone who let herself dwell for very long on her own problems. Taking a break from her packing, the small and slim woman with curly auburn hair, hazel eyes, and a quick smile sat down for a few minutes on her bed and tried to collect her thoughts. She reminded herself that she and her family would be exchanging letters, and that once she settled in Santa Barbara, she might be able to persuade her parents to come down to California and visit her, and maybe see a little bit of the United States. In the meantime, they would keep Olga up to date on all the news she loved to hear the most, all about what was happening in her hometown and the arrival of any new children in the family. And looking around now at her clean, bare bedroom, Olga also reminded herself that this was the moment she had worked so hard to achieve. Her graduation from nursing school and getting her surgical nursing certificate had been one of the best moments of Olga's entire life. When she closed her eyes, she could still practically smell the huge bouquet of fresh flowers she had carried with her on graduation day. And she could still recall how complete she felt, wearing her new crisp white cap that was an emblem of her new profession. Taking a deep breath, Olga stood up from her bed and reached for the last pile of her skirts and slacks, and as she did, she felt all her excitement return to her in a rush. A few minutes later, the young nurse, affectionately known at Vancouver General Hospital as Ollie, gave a last look around and then hurried out of her room to say goodbye to her friends and fellow classmates. A few weeks later, in the fall of 1957, Olga reported for duty at Cottage Hospital in Santa Barbara, California. Ever since arriving a few days earlier and getting settled into her new apartment, Olga had spent hours just drinking in the sights and sounds of her new home. A beautiful gem of a city right on the Central Coast, tucked between the Pacific Ocean and the steep Santa Ynez Mountains. And Olga's impressions of her new hospital job were every bit as positive as her impressions of the city of Santa Barbara. From the moment Olga had walked through the doors of Cottage Hospital, the young Canadian nurse became known for how competent and conscientious she was while she was in the operating room, and for her ability to care for patients who had come through life and death crises. But along with the professionalism that made Olga a favorite among the doctors and supervising nurses, Olga's personality also made her a favorite among her coworkers, who would often stop by Olga's apartment after work to swap stories and Cottage Hospital gossip. And Olga would not be at work long at Cottage Hospital before she had her own exciting news to share with her friends. Because early in November, just a few months after stepping off the train that had taken her from Vancouver to California, Olga had met the young Santa Barbara lawyer who would later become her husband. Like most patients and family of patients who find themselves in a hospital, 28-year-old Frank Duncan had arrived at Cottage Hospital early in the morning of November 7, 1957, because of a medical emergency. Frank was there because his mother, Elizabeth Duncan, known as Betty, had overdosed on sleeping pills, and Olga was one of the nurses assigned to care for her. Although Betty Duncan would make a full recovery, she remained in a coma with Frank at her side for nearly 4 days. And during that time, Frank and Olga wound up seeing a lot of each other. And it wasn't long before the criminal defense attorney and the surgical nurse fell into the habit of talking to one another about their personal lives. Olga told Frank about the tiny town where she grew up, in a province that was almost twice the size of the whole state of California, but with a lot fewer people. And Frank told Olga his very different story about growing up in several apartments and households as he followed his mother, Betty, through a series of marriages and divorces before the two of them had arrived here in Santa Barbara just 2 years earlier. But despite their differences, Olga and Frank also had a lot in common. Like Olga, Frank was a hard worker who had held down 2 and 3 jobs in order to put himself through law school in San Francisco while also helping to support his mother. Betty's marriages had produced 6 children, but not a lot of savings. And now, at the age of 53, Frank's mother had felt alone and financially dependent on Frank and his comfortable income. In fact, as Frank told Olga, it had been the prospect of living by herself after her latest marriage ended that had driven Frank's mom to attempt suicide via the sleeping pill overdose. Olga was horrified, and she could also relate to Frank's terrible sense of guilt over his mother's feelings of desperation and abandonment. Because to both Olga and Frank, family obligation was not just an idea, it was at the very heart of who they were. By the time Frank's mother was well enough to leave the hospital, Frank had settled it so that Betty would come back to his apartment and live with him. When Betty was finally discharged, Frank thanked Olga for all her help and support, but when Frank left Cottage Hospital, gently guiding Betty out the door and toward the parking lot, Olga felt a sudden pang of regret. She had liked Frank, liked his dark wavy hair, his intelligent eyes behind his horn-rimmed glasses, and she liked the way he talked, with just the slightest lisp that made his S's and Z's sound like a TH sound. But Olga did not have to miss Frank for very long. It would turn out that Frank felt the same attraction to Olga that she felt for him. And by January, 2 months after the pair had first met, they were dating, getting together at least 3 or 4 times a week. And it wasn't long after that Frank had fallen in love with Olga, and Olga was telling her coworkers at Cottage Hospital, as well as her family, that she was pretty sure she had just found Mr. Right. And sure enough, 5 months later, on the beautiful morning of Friday, June 20th, 1958, Olga and Frank walked together hand in hand down to the famous Santa Barbara courthouse, where they were married in a ceremony performed by a superior court judge. The simple service was just what they had wanted it to be. Just the two of them, no expensive or elaborate wedding, and no family having to undertake the hours and expense of traveling from Olga's home in Manitoba to the central California coast. But it did not take long before Olga and Frank's marriage started showing signs of serious trouble. As soon as Frank moved out from living with his mother to go live in an apartment of his own with Olga, both Frank and Olga became acutely aware of just how tightly Frank's mother, Betty Duncan, wanted to fasten her apron strings around her favorite and most financially successful child. It apparently wasn't enough that Betty was still able to stay in Frank's old apartment despite him leaving. What Betty really seemed to want was unlimited access to Frank's time and attention. And when Olga discovered, not long after she and Frank were married, that she was pregnant, things only got worse. Betty never missed out on an opportunity to talk negatively about her new daughter-in-law, even suggesting to Frank that Frank was not the father of Olga's baby. While Frank did his best to persuade Olga that his mother's hostility would eventually disappear as soon as her grandchild was actually born, for Olga, the only silver lining in the situation was the fact that she hardly ever saw Frank's mother in person. Betty may have wanted her son, Frank, to spend all of his free time in the apartment with her, but Frank put in long days at work, and Betty had her own busy and active social life. Always carefully dressed and groomed and wearing stylish glasses with frames that tilted up at the outside edges, Betty was a regular at the courthouse where Frank tried his cases. But Betty and her closest friend and constant companion, an 84-year-old woman named Emma Short, also made the rounds of local businesses and clothing stores, as well as lunch spots like the Woolworth's department store and the Tropical Cafe and Bar in downtown Santa Barbara. Neither woman had their driver's license, so the two of them had become a very familiar sight on the city bus routes, with Betty always leading the way and making the decisions about where the two of them should go and what they should do. So even though Betty's routine included calling Olga and Frank, or just Frank, to complain about being ignored or to describe Olga as a, quote, foreigner who had trapped poor Frank into marriage, it was only Frank that Betty actually wanted to see. Still, it wasn't long before Olga was almost as annoyed as Betty was with Frank, because now, in an effort to keep all the women in his life happy, Frank was shuttling back and forth between the apartment where he lived with Olga and the apartment he had once shared with his mother. Meanwhile, rumors about the couple's troubled marriage had started to swirl among Olga's coworkers and among Betty's friends. And so, just 2 months after Frank and Olga had walked into that courtroom in Santa Barbara to get married, the couple walked into another courthouse in Ventura, California, 27 miles to the south of Santa Barbara, and signed the legal documents that confirmed that their marriage was now officially over. Based on the complaint that the couple presented to the court that the two were not living together, in the eyes of the law, it was now like the marriage had never existed in the first place. But even though this annulment was welcome news to Betty Duncan, it did not mark the end of the relationship between her son, Frank, and Olga. By the time Olga was almost 7 months pregnant, she was in an apartment that Frank had found for her at a place called Garden Street Apartments, located 3 miles from Cottage Hospital. And at least a few times a month, Frank would stop by to eat dinners with Olga and sometimes stay late into the night. Unlike Frank, Olga did not believe that Betty would ever have welcomed Olga or her baby into the Duncan family. But whatever happened, Olga still wanted Frank to be a part of their child's life. In her letters back home to family in Manitoba, Canada, Olga would tell her parents that Frank still had a lot of growing up to do. But if her family really wanted to help her, they could do that just by telling her their news about home and the children. Even though Olga's marriage had not worked out, her attitude was upbeat. She was thrilled that she was going to become a mother, and even though Frank had been a disappointment as a husband, Olga had a close circle of friends and a job that she loved. As she began seeing less and less of Frank, Olga instead spent her time concentrating on her work at Cottage Hospital and on making plans for 2 months in the future when her baby was due to arrive, and when Olga's own mother would be coming to visit and help Olga with her newborn. But even as Olga was adjusting to a life without Frank, which is just what Frank's mother had hoped would happen, Betty started having problems of her own, and these were problems she did not want to share with her son. As a criminal attorney, Frank often represented clients who were guilty, and despite his best efforts to keep them out of jail, some of those clients still wound up behind bars. And to Betty's horror, on November 12th, 6 months after Frank and Olga had gotten married, and 4 months after that marriage had been annulled, Betty had become the target of an extortion scheme related to one of Frank's clients. The wife of one of Frank's clients, who wound up going to jail, had approached Betty while she was eating lunch with her best friend Emma at the Tropical Cafe. This woman, Esperanza Esquivel, walked right up to Betty and promptly accused her son, Frank, of charging Mrs. Esquivel's husband, Frank's client, who happened to be the owner of the Tropical Cafe, too much in legal fees. And now Esperanza demanded that money, $500, back. And if Betty went to Frank or the police about this extortion threat, then Esperanza said she knew 2 men who would hurt or kill the one person Betty loved most in the world, her son Frank. And for Betty, this threat was so terrifying that she did not hesitate to comply. Within days, she had cashed a check Frank had given her to make a down payment on a new typewriter, and instead of making the down payment, Betty handed the $150 over to Esperanza's so-called enforcers. But before Betty could even figure out a way to come up with the remaining $350 that Esperanza had demanded, one of the men Esperanza had hired to collect the money, or they would hurt Frank, had made a new and much bigger demand. And suddenly, Betty Duncan started wondering exactly what it was that she had gotten herself involved in. On Monday, November 17th, 5 days after Betty's meeting with Esperanza Esquivel, Olga arrived for work at Cottage Hospital just as she always did, right on time with her white uniform neatly starched and her cap pinned securely to her hair. Even though she was 7 months pregnant, she was as active and busy in the operating room and tending to patients as she had been the very first day she'd arrived 1 year earlier. The only difference now was that Olga, on one of her recent visits to her obstetrician, had been diagnosed with an inflammation of the nerves in one of her hands that caused a loss of feeling in her fingertips. But other than that, the baby doctor had given Olga a clean bill of health, assuring Olga that the weepy feelings that sometimes came over her were nothing to worry about. And just as Olga's pregnancy had not interfered with her work, it had also not interfered with Olga's modest but important social life. So at the end of that workday on Monday, Olga invited her 2 friends and coworkers, Doreen and Sylvia, back to Olga's apartment, Unit 11 at 114 Garden Street, so she could show them the gown that she was making for her unborn baby. But what was supposed to be a short visit and a light meal of hot buns and coffee soon turned into an entire evening of talking and laughing among the friends. And by the time Doreen and Sylvia had called out their final goodbyes to Olga and piled into a taxicab to head off to their own apartments, it was almost 11 p.m. Smiling, Olga had listened to the last of her friends' laughter before the door of the taxi shut and the car engine revved as the taxi pulled away from the curb. Before her friends had left, Olga had changed out of her work clothes and into her comfortable pink and white quilted bathrobe. Now, standing at her open front entrance, Olga thought about her baby's father. The last time Frank had stopped by to see her was 10 days earlier on November 7th, his 29th birthday. Sighing, Olga stepped back and closed and locked the glass door. She was so preoccupied that she barely heard the sound of another car with a loud engine slowly driving down the street outside the front of Garden Apartments. Still thinking about Frank, she could hardly believe that it was only a year ago that they had first met in Cottage Hospital at the bedside of Frank's mother. When Olga's obstetrician had recently suggested that Olga's weepiness might be caused by temporary depression, she knew he was right. Because even after everything that had happened, Olga still loved the man she had once married. But just as she had written to her mother and father 5 days earlier in her last letter home, Olga also knew that life was short and she was determined to enjoy the rest of it with or without Frank Duncan. And putting Frank out of her mind, Olga turned her thoughts to her mother's upcoming visit, which was planned to begin in just 6 weeks. Olga couldn't wait to see her mother's face when she stepped down from the train and got her first good look at Olga's new home. She knew how much her mother would love Santa Barbara, with its landscape of Spanish-style architecture and red clay tile roofs, and the streets and lawns dotted with palm trees, and once again, Olga thought about how lucky she was just to be there. With that thought in mind, Olga headed to her bathroom to brush her teeth and hang up her robe before turning out the lights and going to bed. But before Olga had even picked up her toothbrush, she was startled by a sudden and very loud knock on the front door of her apartment. Putting her toothbrush back down on the sink counter and pulling her robe even more tightly around her, Olga stepped back into her bedroom. After a moment's hesitation and wondering if maybe this was Frank, Olga ran her fingers through her auburn curls, then walked in the direction of her unexpected visitor. The next day, on Tuesday, November 18th, 1958, Olga Duncan, who was scheduled to assist in a morning surgery, did not report to work at Cottage Hospital. She also wasn't answering her phone. This was so completely unlike Olga, who had not missed a single day of work despite being pregnant, and despite all the upheavals in her personal life, that 2 of her coworkers left the hospital right away to go to Olga's apartment just to make sure that she was okay. But instead of finding that Olga had just overslept, which is what they told each other must have happened, when they got to Garden Apartments, they found the sliding glass door of Olga's apartment open. And inside of her apartment, they could see that the lights were on and the bed had been turned back, but it had not been slept in. The neat pile of baby clothes was exactly where Olga had left it, folded up on the couch, and sitting on her dresser was the purse that Olga never failed to carry with her anytime she left her apartment. And Olga's friends weren't the only people standing next to the open glass door of Olga's apartment trying to make sense of a situation that was suddenly starting to appear very scary and suspicious. Joining them was the apartment manager, Dorothy Barnett, whose eyes, behind her rhinestone-trimmed glasses, were filled with worry and concern. Dorothy had always had a soft spot for her young Canadian tenant and had often referred to Olga as a lovely girl. Olga had always been friendly, quiet, and never late with her rent, just the kind of person that the older landlady would have liked to see in every one of her units. A few minutes later, Frank Duncan would get an urgent call from his office. According to Frank's secretary, it was a woman named Dorothy Barnett, and she was calling to inform Mr. Duncan that Olga had disappeared. Frank received this message while he was in court representing a client named Marciano Esquivel. Stepping away from the courtroom as soon as he could, Frank called the Santa Barbara police station to report that his wife, Olga Duncan, was missing. What Frank did not know, as he returned to the courtroom, was that Marciano Esquivel's wife, Esperanza, had very recently extorted money from Frank's mother, Betty Duncan. At the police station, the officer who took Frank's call had asked Frank what he knew or thought of Olga's apparent disappearance. Unlike Dorothy Barnett and Olga's two hospital co-workers, Frank was concerned, but not alarmed. According to Frank, Olga had been angry with Frank, and that's why she might have left. Or maybe she had decided to go back to her hometown in Manitoba, Canada, and pay a visit to her parents and family. So it wasn't until November 20th, 2 days later, when there was still no sign of Olga, that police issued a missing persons bulletin and assigned a detective to investigate. Over the next 3 weeks, several different officers from the Santa Barbara Police Department would follow up on a variety of tips and leads in their search for Olga Duncan. But it was during the first 72 hours that police developed their initial theory of the case. Based on their examination of Olga's apartment and the interviews with the nurses who had visited with Olga the night before she disappeared, police quickly decided that Olga must have somehow been taken from her apartment against her will. This was based on the fact that she had not made any plans to visit family or friends in Canada or anywhere else that police were aware of, and Olga had left behind all the documents and belongings that people would normally carry with them on any kind of trip. In addition to leaving her purse on top of her dresser, she also left behind all of her luggage, her passport, and her driver's license. And then there was the witness statement that Olga's landlady provided to the police. According to Dorothy, after she heard Olga's friends leaving Olga's apartment at about 11 p.m. on the night of Monday, November 17th, Dorothy reported hearing footsteps on the stairs outside of her own bedroom window. At the time, she believed she was hearing one of her neighbors, but the next day, when Olga was gone, those neighbors told Dorothy no, they had not been walking outside late the night before. The police also ruled out 2 other possible scenarios. Since nothing of value seemed to be missing from Olga's apartment, it did not seem likely that this was some kind of robbery gone wrong. They also ruled out any connection between Olga's disappearance and reports from several days earlier about a man or men who had harassed 2 teenage girls in towns outside of Santa Barbara. Instead, the one person police were most interested in speaking with was Frank Duncan, the father of Olga's unborn baby. Even though Frank and his mother Betty both had alibis for the night that Olga disappeared, they spent that evening together watching TV, police were very curious about the role that Frank and Betty had played in Olga's life, especially when Frank himself would eventually admit to police that even after separating from Olga, he continued to visit her, a fact that Frank had tried to hide from his mother. But much to the surprise of local detectives, it was not Olga's disappearance that brought Frank and Betty into the Santa Barbara police station on November 22nd, 4 days after Olga went missing. Instead, it was a totally different criminal matter. In response to questions from Frank about what had become of the money Frank had given Betty so she could make a down payment on the typewriter Frank wanted to buy, Frank's mother had finally told Frank about the extortion demands from Esperanza Esquivel. Outraged over the threats that the Esquivels had made to his mother, that unless she paid them back the legal fees he had charged them, they would physically harm Frank, Frank dragged his mother off to the police station to file a formal complaint against Esperanza and her 2 enforcers, charging them with extortion and blackmail. Betty explained to police that she had given one of Esperanza's enforcers $150, but now they had bumped up their demand from a total of $500 to $2,000. And unless police could find and jail Esperanza's enforcers, Betty was worried that she and Frank would never be safe, especially since Betty had never gotten a close enough look at the men's faces to be able to recognize and identify them. What puzzled the police was that Frank did not seem at all worried about whether Olga's life might also be in danger. If these extortionists or blackmailers or whoever they were would harm the attorney and his mother, why would they ignore the mother of Frank's unborn baby? But without any hard evidence to connect Olga's disappearance to the extortion scheme, and without a description from Betty about what these enforcers looked like, all police could do was set up phone taps on Frank's and Betty's home telephones in case the extortionists tried to contact Betty or Frank by phone. Meanwhile, by the end of November, so roughly 2 weeks since Olga's disappearance, the key figures in the investigation had already started to move on with their lives. Betty was still working with Santa Barbara police, looking at mugshots of potential suspects in her extortion case, but still not able to make any positive IDs. Due to the publicity surrounding Olga's disappearance, Frank had left Betty and Santa Barbara and moved 95 miles south to Los Angeles to look for a new job. And by December 10th, not only had Frank found work, he was also spotted stepping out on a date with a new, attractive woman he'd met in San Francisco. But on December 12th, 3 weeks after Olga's disappearance, and 2 weeks after Betty had told police about her blackmailers, Olga's disappearance would once again take center stage in Frank and Betty's lives. That's when 30-year-old Santa Barbara detective Charles Thompson literally stumbled on the information that would break the mystery of what happened to Olga wide open. Only recently assigned to the extortion and missing person cases, Detective Thompson had decided to re-interview friends and acquaintances of Olga, Frank, and Betty. And while going over the statement of one of the very minor players in both cases, Detective Thompson listened in disbelief as this very unlikely source let slip a piece of information that would change everything police knew or thought about Olga's disappearance. On the following day, Saturday, December 13th, the Santa Barbara police made their first arrest. And on Sunday, December 21st, so 1 month and 4 days after Olga's disappearance, 3 Santa Barbara detectives were standing next to their parked police car at the edge of Casitas Pass Road, 17 miles south of Santa Barbara and just over the line into Ventura County. In front of them was a narrow, steep-sided gully that sloped about 20 feet down from the deserted 2-lane highway. Leaning a little bit forward, the officers could just make out the end of a corrugated metal drainage pipe that ran side to side directly under the road where they had parked their car. Standing next to the detectives was the passenger who had come with them from the Santa Barbara police station. After a few moments of looking, the passenger raised their hand and pointed to a shallow depression just in front of the end of the metal drainage pipe. A few minutes later, the passenger was back inside the car, while the 3 detectives, carrying the shovel that they had stowed in the car trunk, were slipping and sliding their way down to the bottom of the pit. Based on the information that passenger had provided to Santa Barbara police, along with the information gathered by Detective Thompson 9 days earlier, here is a reconstruction of what really happened to Olga Duncan almost 5 weeks earlier on the night of Monday, November 17th, and early in the morning of Tuesday, November 18th. After Olga said goodbye to her friends at about 11 p.m. on that Monday night, she didn't notice that the car with the loud engine that she'd heard coming down the street had actually stopped right outside of her apartment building. Olga had been so busy thinking about her baby, about Frank, and then about her mother's upcoming visit to Santa Barbara that the sudden silence as the driver turned off the car engine did not even register. And neither did the sound of quiet footsteps as the person inside of that car got out and walked up the stairs to the sliding glass door of Olga's apartment. The first Olga knew about the arrival of her surprise visitor was the sound of urgent knocking on her front door. And when she stepped out of her bedroom to see who it was, her first feeling was just disappointment. Even through the drapes that covered the door, she could tell that the shadowy figure outside was not Frank. But that feeling of disappointment immediately turned to concern when she heard a voice telling her that something was wrong with Frank, and Frank needed Olga's help. Still dressed in her pink and white quilted robe and house slippers, Olga opened the door just wide enough to have a conversation. She did not invite her visitor in, but once Olga had heard that Frank was actually sitting in a car right outside and that he was very, very drunk, Olga agreed to go downstairs and check on him. A moment later, Olga had stepped out of her apartment, not even bothering to turn out the lights or pull the door closed all the way behind her. A minute later, Olga was on the street, leaning down to look through the front car window at a man huddled in the passenger seat. But even as Olga realized that this man was not Frank Duncan, it was too late. The next thing she knew, there was an explosion of pain in her head as the man behind her brought the butt of a .22 caliber pistol down on the back of Olga's skull. Even as Olga's attacker yanked open the back door of the car and started pushing Olga inside, the man who had been slumped in the front seat had turned around so he could help pull the unconscious nurse onto the back seat of the gray 1948 Chevy. Moments later, Olga's first attacker had run around the car and slipped behind the wheel into the driver's seat, while his partner in the passenger seat sat up straight and looked around to make sure there was no one watching them. Then, with a grinding of gears, the old Chevy pulled away from the curb to begin the 230-mile trip from Santa Barbara south to Tijuana, Mexico. For the two young men in the front seats of the car, there was nothing personal about this kidnapping or about what they planned to do with Olga once they reached Mexico. Instead, this was an opportunity of a lifetime. They'd been promised $6,000 for making Olga disappear, an amount of money that today would be worth more than $31,000 for each of them. But almost as soon as they had left Garden Apartments, the men's carefully laid plans for how to kill Olga Duncan started to fall apart. They had not even made it out of Santa Barbara before Olga had regained consciousness and began struggling and screaming for help. Pulling off the main road and parking the car along a track to a deserted beach, both men got out and opened the rear passenger doors. Leaning in over their struggling and terrified kidnap victim, one of the men held Olga down while the other started hitting her head again and again with the butt of his gun, using so much force that the pistol actually broke. Once Olga was finally still, with blood now pouring out of her head into the car seat right under her, the men used the tape they'd brought with them to bind Olga's hands and feet before they got back into the front seats and began heading once again for the main road south. But the kidnappers had only driven 13 more miles before they started to have car trouble. And instead of driving to Mexico, they were forced to get rid of Olga's body somewhere much closer to home. Turning onto rural Highway 33 South out of Santa Barbara, they headed through the mountains toward a very small town in Ventura County. And along the way, on Casitas Pass Road, the two men found exactly the spot they were looking for. Pulling the car over to the side of the road, they killed the engine and then got out to look down at a steep-sided gully 20 feet below the road and at the opening of the drainage pipe that ran crossways underneath the road where they were standing. A few minutes later, sometime after 1 a.m. in the morning of Tuesday, November 18th, the two men dragged Olga's body out of the car and down the side of the ravine to a slight depression in front of the outflow pipe. Since their gun was now broken and would not fire, the two men took turns beating and then strangling Olga. When they were sure that the young mother-to-be was dead, they used their hands to dig a shallow grave, then rolled Olga over until she lay inside the hole. After covering Olga with dirt and gravel, the two men climbed out of the gully, hopped back into the 1948 Chevy they had rented the evening before for $25, and drove back to Santa Barbara. After getting rid of their bloody clothes and cleaning Olga's blood off the back seat before returning their rented car, the two murderers were ready to collect their paychecks. So, later that same morning, 20-year-old Luis Moya and 25-year-old Agustin Baldonado picked up the phone and called their employer, Betty Duncan, to tell her that the daughter-in-law she had hated so much was now dead, along with Frank's unborn child. It would turn out that Betty Duncan was so possessive of her beloved son Frank that when Frank met and fell in love with Olga at Cottage Hospital back in November of 1957, Betty was out of her mind with jealousy. From the moment Frank started dating Olga, Betty had done everything she could to break up the romance, calling Olga at least once a day for more than 3 months to threaten and insult the young woman and to scream at her to leave her son Frank alone. But it wasn't until Frank and Olga snuck off to be married at a civil service in June of 1958, by which time Olga was already pregnant, that Betty moved her hate campaign into high gear. On the couple's wedding night, Betty, who had found out about the marriage from a switchboard operator at Cottage Hospital, showed up at the apartment that Frank and Olga had rented and demanded that Frank come back to the apartment he shared with his mother. But even though Frank agreed to do just that, he refused to break all of his ties to Olga. So 2 months later, on August 7th, Betty decided to take steps of her own to legally end the marriage, using the same skills at deceit and lying that had allowed Betty to marry and divorce 11 times and con most of her unsuspecting spouses out of some or all of their money. Betty paid an odd job worker from the local Salvation Army $60 to go with her to Ventura Courthouse. Once there, the two of them actually managed to impersonate Frank and Olga and get Frank's marriage annulled. After faking that annulment, Betty started working on a more ambitious plan, permanently erasing her son's wife from the face of the earth. And over the next 4 months, Betty would approach 5 different people to see if they would kill Olga. All of them declined until Esperanza Esquivel put Betty in touch with 2 small-time criminals, Luis Moya and Agustin Baldonado, who agreed on a price of $6,000 for murdering Olga Duncan. What the killers did not know was that Betty had never intended to pay them $6,000. Instead, after making a down payment of $150 using Frank's typewriter money, Betty was already busy making up a story in which she was the innocent victim of extortion and her 2 hired guns would be the blackmailers she would later report to the Santa Barbara police. It wasn't until December 12, 1958, 3 weeks after Olga's murder, that Betty's best friend and constant companion, 84-year-old Emma Short, would tell Detective Charles Thompson about Betty impersonating Olga in order to get Frank's marriage annulled. Emma would also talk to police about Betty's hatred for Olga and Betty's various plots to get her daughter-in-law murdered. 1 day later, on December 13th, police arrested Betty Duncan for forgery and filing false legal papers in order to get her son's marriage annulled. And once Betty was in jail and police began investigating the information they'd gotten from Emma Short, it would only take 2 more weeks before police had also arrested Olga's killers. On Sunday, December 21st, Agustin Baldonado confessed to murder and described to police what had happened on the night that Olga was kidnapped. Then, Agustin agreed to lead the 3 Santa Barbara detectives to Casitas Pass Road, where Agustin and Luis had buried Olga's body. But it was not until the Ventura County medical examiner completed an autopsy on Olga Duncan that the police and the public would understand the full horror of what had happened to the young nurse from Canada whose baby girl was due to be born in less than 2 months. It would turn out that despite being beaten, pistol-whipped, and strangled, Olga Duncan was still alive when Agustin Baldonado and Luis Moya rolled her body into that shallow grave. In the end, the cause of Olga's death was suffocation, and her final breaths were lungfuls of dirt and gravel. On March 17, 1959, after what newspapers described as California's trial of the decade, Elizabeth Betty Duncan, Luis Moya, and Agustin Baldonado were all found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to death. 3.5 years later, on August 7, 1962, Luis and Agustin stepped into the same gas chamber at San Quentin Prison, where they were strapped into adjoining wooden chairs and executed. The next day, on August 8, 1962, at 10 in the morning, Betty Duncan was executed alone in the same gas chamber, the last woman ever to be executed in the state of California. Betty Duncan's last words were, "Where's Frank?" On December 30th, 1958, 9 days after the discovery of Olga's body and just over 1 year after the young nurse met Frank and Betty Duncan, Frank arranged a small service in memory of his murdered wife. Weeks later, Frank finally agreed to release Olga's cremated remains and send them back to her parents in Benito, Manitoba. Frank would go on to marry 2 more times. He would also go on to build a successful law practice in Los Angeles. Even though Frank defended his mother to the very end, after her execution, Frank refused to answer any questions about his mother's trial or the murder of his wife, Olga Duncan. One of the most dangerous Olympic sports is called luge. In a nutshell, 1 or 2 people who are called lugers will ride a sled down a hill as fast as they can. But this hill is this narrow, winding, banked ice track, and these lugers will ride a sled that will go as fast as 80 miles per hour or faster. While accidents in luging are actually quite uncommon, when they do occur, they can be catastrophic. In 1986, a luge track was built on a ski hill in Alberta, Canada, for the luge event of the 1988 Winter Olympics. This track and the surrounding ski area was called Canada Olympic Park. After the Olympics were over, this park was open to the public for recreational purposes. Nearly 30 years later, on January 29, 2016, 3 teenage boys snuck into Canada Olympic Park after hours. They made their way up the hill until they reached this blue 6-foot-tall fence that was covered with warnings telling people to stay back and don't go past this fence unless you are authorized personnel, and these 3 teenage boys were not authorized personnel. Inside of this 6-foot-tall blue fence was what looked like this tall flight of stairs that led up to what looked almost like a log cabin. And that cabin was the starting house of the luge track. The track literally came out of the cabin and fed down below. The 3 boys, one of which had actually worked at this park the winter before selling tickets, they looked at each other and grinned and then chucked their plastic sleds over this blue fence, and then they climbed up and over themselves. Once on the other side, they each picked up their sled and then made their way up the stairs into the starting house. Once they were inside, they kind of arranged themselves to see who would go first, second, and third. They put their helmets on because they all brought helmets. They strapped on headlamps so they could see the course because there were no lights on the course. And then one by one, they began going down this luge track. But surprisingly, it wasn't that fast. As they went down, they would actually stop and have to use their feet to get going again. But that was because they had these cheap plastic sleds that were not designed for this luge course. What you needed were these specialty sleds with blades on the sides that got you up to full speed. And so after the 3 boys eventually, slowly, painfully made their way all the way down to the bottom of this luge track, they were pretty disappointed, but they thought, okay, well, let's just all get in one sled and we'll go down again, and with the added weight, we should go faster. And so they marched their way back up, all the way up to the top of the starting house, and all 3 of them sat in one sled and they pushed off, and sure enough, they went way faster. They bombed all the way down this track. It was so much fun. They were totally exhilarated. And after doing it a couple more times, they decided, okay, our luck's gonna run out. We're gonna get caught. And so they climbed back over that blue fence and snuck out of the park without getting caught. The following weekend, those 3 same boys, along with 5 of their friends they had recruited, returned to Canada Olympic Park after hours. And so the 3 boys that had been there the weekend before, they led the group up the hill. They got to that blue fence that surrounded the luge starting house. And one by one, each of these teenage boys climbed up and over this fence, and they made their way up the stairs into the starting house. Once they were inside, they began figuring out who was going to go in each of the 3 sleds they had brought along. And they determined they would put 3 boys in the first sled, 3 boys in the second sled, and 2 boys in the final sled. Because of how successful the previous weekend's trip down the luge track had been, according to the 3 boys that had gone, this time the group decided they did not need helmets because this was relatively safe. They also decided not to bring headlamps because they figured it would be more exhilarating to go flying down this track in the darkness. And so a little after midnight on February 6th, the first 3 boys climbed into the first sled and pushed off. At first, it was going exactly to plan. It was fun, they were going fast, it was exhilarating, but then disaster struck. Unlike the previous weekend, this weekend, there was a metal chain that had been strung across one of the sections towards the bottom of the luge track. It was there to keep a particular section of the track in place. And so these boys, as they come flying around the corner, they don't see it, and they strike this chain at full speed. Now, this chain was at neck height, and so when it hit them, it instantly decapitated and killed one of the boys. It was a 17-year-old named Evan Caldwell. And so he dies immediately, and the other two are thrown from the sled and landed unconscious. Now, back up at the starting house, they have no way of knowing this has happened to the first sled. Not only because they can't see anything, but also because the boys in the first sled are not making any sound. They're either unconscious or deceased. And so at some point, this second group of boys thinks they've waited long enough to account for the first sled to get down and out of the way. And so they load up their sled and they push off. And so they go flying down, it's going great, but just like the first sled, at some point they turn that corner and they hit that chain. But miraculously, the second group of 3 boys, they hit the chain in such a way that they kind of slipped under it. And so they were all thrown from their sled and kind of smashed into the track, but the worst injury of the second sled was just a broken ankle. And so this group, they stand up and they're totally disoriented. It's dark. They don't know what they just ran into. And before they had a chance to kind of collect their thoughts and yell up to the starting house to try to warn the third and final group not to go, it was already too late. All the boys could do in the second sled group was to just get out of the way as the third and final sled carrying the final 2 boys came bombing down, and they too struck that chain at full speed. One of the 2 boys on board this third and final sled was a 17-year-old named Jordan Caldwell, and he too, unfortunately, would be decapitated by the chain and would die instantly. And he was actually the twin brother of Evan Caldwell, the boy on the first sled who had also died. The other boy on the third sled would be thrown from the sled and would suffer grievous injuries as well. One of the survivors of the crash, who was actually on the first sled, his name was Caleb, and he was knocked unconscious from being thrown. When he came to, he was laying in a section of the track that was covered by a tarp, and at first he couldn't see anything, he couldn't hear anything, but he just felt like there was something lodged in his throat, and it was making it very hard to breathe. Most likely that was just from his throat being crushed in from hitting that chain. And so as he's struggling to breathe, his senses began to come back to him, and his sight came back, and he noticed he was laying down, and one of the boys who had been on the second sled was kneeling next to him. This was one of the boys that had not been badly hurt, and he had his hand on Caleb's shoulder, and he was praying for Caleb to survive. And so as Caleb is taking in that someone is praying over him, he notices somewhere else, his hearing is starting to pick up. He can hear someone else, and it would turn out to be a boy named Mark, who was on the first sled, who had been very badly injured. His face was very badly beaten up. He was laying somewhere nearby, and he was just singing this religious song. He was trying to keep spirits high, and he was trying to will people to hold on and to survive as long as they possibly could. And then Caleb remembered hearing someone calling 911, and then he doesn't remember what happened next. When the paramedics ultimately arrived within the hour, they got to the track and they found all of these boys spread out all over the track, because when they hit this chain, they got sent flying. But they discovered the twins were actually laying right next to each other, and none of these surviving boys had moved their bodies. And so even though the grief was just unfathomable amongst this family that had lost their 2 sons, there was some solace in the fact that despite having come down in different sleds, that the twins, Evan and Jordan, were together in their final moments. The 6 survivors of this accident would walk away from it with life-changing head injuries and other medical issues, and they would walk away with an indescribable sense of guilt and regret. But they consider themselves lucky because at least they survived. The next story, which is our number 2 story on today's list, is called The Loner. Mary Cerruti had a difficult childhood. Growing up in the 1950s and early 1960s in Houston, Texas, Mary's family barely had enough money to get by, and then by the time Mary was 21, both of her parents had passed away, leaving her with nothing. After their deaths, Mary kind of bounced around Houston, going from one low-paying job to the next, and then eventually she met a man that she fell madly in love with, and they got married, but unfortunately that marriage would end in divorce. After Mary got over that heartbreak, she would meet another man who she would also fall in love with, and they would get married too, but like her first marriage, this one also ended in divorce. At this point, Mary was so devastated by yet another heartbreak that she just kind of accepted that she was not gonna get married again. She was not gonna have a family of her own. But she didn't let this get her down. Instead, she kind of embraced her life as a loner. Fast forward to 2015, and Mary was 61 years old and she was still living alone. She lived in a small home in a Houston neighborhood. This neighborhood, over the last several decades, had really begun to grow. Lots of new apartment complexes were being built all the time, and in fact, one of the apartment developers had approached Mary and offered to buy her house so they could build over her land, but she had refused because she loved her house. She did not want to sell it. It didn't matter what they offered her. And so she was the only house in this long stretch of apartment buildings that didn't sell. But Mary kind of liked it. She wrote in her diary that her bungalow was like a castle, and all these apartment buildings all around her were her castle walls. Mary didn't really have much contact with other people. She didn't have a consistent job, so she didn't have relationships with coworkers. She didn't have much contact, if any, with her living family, and she really didn't have any friends, with the exception of one woman who was in town who owned an arts and crafts shop, who Mary would periodically go into town and say hello to. But despite all that, Mary was not lonely. She had lots and lots of cats, and she loved cats. Anytime she saw a stray cat out in the neighborhood, Mary would get the cat food and water and then eventually would try to coax the cat to come into her house. And then when it did, she would win the cat's trust, and then she would give it a place to live and she would feed it and take care of it. And so before long, she had dozens of cats living in the house with her. And so these cats kind of became Mary's best friends, and so she rarely left the house, if ever. She mostly just stayed in the house with them. In February of that year, one of Mary's neighbors happened to be walking by her property, and they looked over and they saw a stack of mail had grown on her front porch, indicating that Mary had not opened her door to get her mail. And this neighbor also noticed that while Mary's property did tend to get a little bit overgrown with the trees and the grass, it was exceptionally overgrown, like no one was even trying to take care of it. And so this neighbor was concerned that maybe something had happened to Mary, and so they opened up her fence, they walked across the yard, they went up onto the porch, and they knocked on the front door, but it was silent. And so this neighbor kind of leaned over and looked in the window that was just to the left of the door to see if maybe they could look inside, but there was a curtain drawn across that window, so they couldn't see anything. And so the neighbor tried knocking on the door one more time, but again, met with silence. And so after standing there for a minute, the neighbor left the front porch and walked around to the side of the house to see if maybe they could look in one of those windows, but when they went around to the side, those windows were covered with curtains too. So the neighbor walked back to the front of the property and just stood there looking at the house, wondering what they should do. And something told them that something's off, something's wrong, someone needs to make sure Mary really is okay. Someone needs to get inside of this house. And so the neighbor called the Houston police and explained the situation. A few minutes later, the Houston police arrived and they too went right up onto Mary's porch. They knocked on her door. It was met with silence. And so after that, the police talked to one of the other neighbors and got a key that Mary had apparently given them previously. And the police went back to Mary's front door. They used the key. They unlocked the door. They opened it up. And right away, they were hit with this horrible smell coming from inside the house. The police pushed the door the rest of the way open and they stepped inside and they yelled out for Mary, but it was silent. And then before the police even began walking around looking for her, they looked off to their left and the right inside of the house, and they saw there were all these dead cats all over the ground. And so the Houston police didn't know what happened to Mary, but right away they're thinking, okay, we've seen scenarios like this before where someone who lives alone that no one really checks on dies unexpectedly, and then when they pass away, all of their pets are trapped in the house, they're not getting fed, and so they pass away too. And so the police at this point are fully expecting to find Mary's dead body somewhere in the house, and so they begin walking through the house looking for it. But after searching the house top to bottom, they could not find Mary. And so the police leave Mary's house, and at this point there are people outside gathered because they see the police cars. And so the police grabbed a couple of the neighbors and they asked them, do you know anything about this woman? Did she say anything about where she was going? Did you see her leave at any point? And the consensus amongst the neighbors they spoke to was that Mary basically kept to herself. She did not travel. She didn't go anywhere. She mostly just stayed in her house with her cats. And so it was very unlikely that she would have just abandoned the property and abandoned her cats because she loved them so much. And so the police at this point are thinking, okay, she's got to be in this house somewhere. And so the police called a few more officers to the property, and the group went back inside of Mary's house, and they really looked for Mary, thinking that, maybe she slipped into a closet and that's where she passed away, or, maybe she's just hidden somewhere in the house. And so they really kind of ripped the house apart looking for her, but again, there was just nothing. And so after they finally stopped the search without finding Mary, the police contacted Mary's extended family and they asked them the same questions. Did Mary say anything about a trip she was going to take? Is there any reason she would just abandon her property? And they all would say, look, we don't talk to Mary. We don't know where she went. We have no idea. And so for a little while, the Houston police continued to search for Mary in and around Houston, but eventually, after finding nothing, the search kind of stopped, and they reached out to Mary's family and said, if you hear anything else about what happened to Mary, please let us know. Several months later, Mary's house went into foreclosure because no one was making the payments anymore, and the bank put her house up for auction. And a real estate entrepreneur in Houston bought the house up quickly, and after cleaning it out, he put it on the market to be rented out. And for the next couple of years, several tenants lived in Mary's old house, none of them staying for very long. Then in March of 2017, when the property was vacant, this young couple reached out to the landlord and said they were looking to rent, and they were hoping to potentially stay in this property for 2 or 3 years. The landlord was thrilled, and he sent over a lease for them to sign. And then once the couple had signed the lease and the property was theirs, the husband decided to just go over on his own and walk around the property and see what they would need to buy in terms of furnishings. And so the husband arrives at the property, he goes in the front door, he walks around the first floor, and then at some point he decides he wants to go up into the attic to see how much storage space they have. And so he gets underneath the trap door in the ceiling, he grabs the string and he pulls it down, revealing this folded up ladder. He flips down the lower ladder piece and puts it on the ground, and then he began climbing up. Once he got up into the attic, he stayed standing on the ladder and just kind of scanned around, and he saw there really wasn't much up there. There was a couple of metal cages that appeared to have been for pets or something, but it was very dirty and dark, and it appeared like no one had really come up here in a long time. And he kind of assumed that, the other tenants weren't using this as a storage space. And so the husband was about to go back down the ladder when he noticed off to the right side of the attic, kind of far away from the ladder, right where the roof begins to pitch down, he saw one of the floorboards was kind of popped up like it shouldn't be. And he stared at it and he's looking around at the rest of the attic and all of the floorboards were perfectly uniform, but that one was really jacked up. And so he was curious, and so he climbed up into the attic and he kind of stooped down and he walked over to this loose floorboard. And when he was standing over it, he could tell that this floorboard had kind of popped off of this hole in the ground, that the floorboard had been covering this hole, but the hole was dark. And so he pulled out his phone and he turned on his flashlight and he looked straight down and he aimed the light into this hole. Now, this hole was basically just a gap between two of the walls on the first floor. And so he's shining his light down into this gap, and he sees at the bottom the remains of the woman the Houston police have been looking for the past 2 years, Mary Cerruti. While no one knows for sure exactly what happened to her, it's believed back in early 2015 when she went missing, she had gone up into the attic where perhaps her cats liked to sunbathe off to the side of the attic because there was a big window that looked into the attic. And so she went up there to maybe feed the cats or check on the cats that were up there. And when she walked over to that side of the attic where the window looked in, she stepped on that loose floorboard and it gave out from her weight and she kind of fell through it like a trap door and fell down into that gap between the walls. It's unlikely she was hurt from this fall, but when she stood back up again in this kind of narrow space, she would have realized very quickly that there was nowhere for her to go. You can't go left, you can't go right, and you can't get back up into the attic. It was too far up for her to reach, and there was no way for her to kind of use the walls to climb back up because the space she was in was so narrow. I mean, she could barely move. She also didn't have a cell phone on her, so she couldn't call anyone. If she screamed out, no one would have heard her because she was behind several walls of insulation. And because no one ever checked on her, there was no one that was just going to find her trapped in the wall. She was totally on her own. And so trapped in this little space, Mary spent probably a couple of days screaming and trying to get her way out, but nothing worked. And then eventually she passed away. And then unfortunately, all of her cats did too. Her death was ruled an accident. The next and final story, which is the top story of today's list, is called Ruahine Range. In late 2002, 25-year-old Jason Chase worked as a sheep shearer in an area called Gisborne, which is located in the northeastern section of New Zealand. When Jason wasn't working, he was often on his bike, cycling up and down the coast, preparing for his next road race. In early December of that year, Jason contacted his family, who lived in a small town called Dannevirke, which is located about 200 miles southwest of Gisborne, and he told them that he wanted to come visit them for Christmas. However, he didn't know exactly when he would actually arrive at their house because his training and work schedule were fairly hectic, but he told them, "Don't worry, I will be there at least on Christmas Day, December 25th, or a couple of days earlier." His family was thrilled, and they said, "No problem, we can't wait to see you whenever that is." And so by the time mid-December rolled around and Jason still had not arrived at his family's home in Dannevirke, his family wasn't concerned at all. However, that would soon change. On December 13th, a hunter was driving along the many winding back roads of the Ruahine mountain range. This mountain range, which is located about 8 miles north of Dannevirke, is a very isolated and rugged wilderness area that's full of steep gorges and gullies and very thick brush. And so as this hunter rounds the turn on this road, he looks up ahead and he sees there's a car parked on the side of the road. And so this hunter pulls up right alongside this car and he looks over and he can tell, there's no one inside of it, there's no obvious damage to the car. And then the hunter began kind of scanning around the area to see if there was some obvious reason someone would stop right at that particular spot. But when he looked around, all he saw was thick trees on either side and the mountain kind of sloped down on either side. And so there was nothing unique about the spot. And so something just kind of struck the hunter as odd about this car. It just seemed totally out of place. And so operating on a hunch, the hunter would leave the mountain range and head into Dannevirke, and he would contact police and he would tell them about this car and where it was located, because in the hunter's mind, maybe someone had been reported missing in the area and maybe this car is connected. And so after hearing about the car, the police did not know of any missing person cases that were connected to a car that matched the description the hunter had given. But just to be safe, the police hopped in their vehicles and they drove up into the Ruahine mountain range and they went to the spot the hunter described. And sure enough, off to the side of the road is this parked car and it's still unoccupied. After inspecting the vehicle, the police came to the same conclusion the hunter did, that there was no obvious signs of damage to the car that might have forced someone to abandon it. And then when they looked in the window at the gas gauge, they saw the gauge was full. And so the police kind of wandered around the area, kind of doing an initial search to see if maybe the owner of this car was nearby. But, there was no one there. They're in this very isolated part of this wilderness area. And so the police just took down the license plate of the car and they went back to their station. And when they got there, they ran the license plate number and it turned out the car belonged to Jason Chase. When Jason's family was contacted about, why is Jason's car up in the Ruahine Mountains, where's Jason, his family was pretty surprised. They explained to police that Jason had made plans to come visit them around Christmas time, and so they were expecting him to come this way. And the Ruahine mountain range, it is only 8 miles away from Dannevirke, so in theory, maybe he stopped there on the way to their house, but they told police that just didn't make any sense. So, as a precaution, the police decided to launch a search for Jason. And unfortunately, despite hundreds of people on the ground searching the Ruahine mountain range and helicopters overhead flying all over the place, no trace of Jason was found. And so the official search was called off right before Christmas, but Jason's family and friends, they continued to look for him. And on January 3rd, they would find him. One of the family friends who had agreed to continue looking for Jason after the official search had shut down was a farmer who owned a plane. And on January 3rd, as he did one of his passes over the foothills of the Ruahine mountain range, he looked down and he saw this bright red thing that looked totally out of place. And the pilot couldn't tell what it was, and so he took note of its location, and then when he landed, he passed those coordinates off to the ground team. And so the ground team, they made their way over to this location, which was quite far away from where Jason's car had been. And after making their way through some very thick brush and some very steep sections, they eventually walked out to this big open clearing. It was a dry riverbed, and right in front of them, in the middle of it, was the bright red thing. It was Jason's shirt, and Jason was still wearing it. He was found lying on his left side with his legs stretched out, He had on his bright red rugby t-shirt, some khaki shorts on, and he had no shoes or socks on. According to the searchers who first saw Jason in this dry creek bed, they would say the scene was very peaceful and it almost looked like Jason had lied down to fall asleep. But Jason was not sleeping, he was dead. Jason had no visible injuries, and there was no sign of a struggle in the area. In fact, it didn't even look like Jason had been in the wild for very long because his clothes were pristine, and despite being barefoot, his feet were in great condition. Despite a lengthy search around the area where his body was discovered, his shoes and socks would not be recovered. The only thing they found in the area was a water bottle that belonged to Jason. Adding to the mystery of what happened to Jason were the results of his autopsy. The pathologist was unable to find any injuries. Jason also seemed well-nourished because he had food in his stomach, and he was hydrated because there was urine in his bladder. His toxicology report also came back negative for all drugs, medications, and a range of common poisons. The only odd thing the pathologist found during the autopsy was that Jason had 2 very small ulcers in his duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. According to this pathologist, these type of ulcers only appear from acute stress moments before death. However, these ulcers don't indicate what caused the stress. Typically, things like severe injury or septicemia, which is blood poisoning, will cause these stress ulcers. But Jason had neither of those. So at the end of the autopsy, the pathologist concluded that Jason had not been the victim of a homicide, he had not committed suicide, he had died from, quote, obscure natural causes. Interestingly, though, the pathologist was able to determine with some certainty that Jason died on or around December 30th, which means he was alive for the entirety of the official search for him, as well as the bulk of that private search conducted by friends and family. After the autopsy results came out, Jason's case was closed, and his family, despite having lots of unanswered questions, was forced to just move on. 15 years later, the same pathologist that had conducted Jason's autopsy was talking to a colleague about Jason's case. And as he was describing where Jason was found, the colleague suddenly stopped the pathologist and said, "Wait a minute, I think I know what happened to him." And it would turn out he did. The following is a reconstruction of what happened to Jason Chase. On December 13th, 2002, Jason left his home in Gisborne and began heading south towards Dannevirke, where his family lived. But before he got to his family's home, he took a detour up into the Ruahine mountain range, where he eventually parked his car on the side of the road. Once his car was stopped, he got out and collected his backpack and sleeping bag. Those were 2 items that were never discovered during the search or after his body was found, but it was later determined they were missing from his vehicle. And so after he has his pack and his sleeping bag, he also grabs a water bottle, and then he leaves the main road and begins walking into the woods, making his way down the mountain. He eventually would find a spot on the side of the mountain that he liked, and so he set up a campsite. What happens next is very confusing because we don't actually know why Jason actually went camping in the first place or when he intended to leave, but we can make one assumption. Whatever he was doing in the mountains, he planned on wrapping it up in time to still get to his family's house in Dannevirke on or before Christmas Day, December 25th. So from December 13th, when he first got out of his car and entered the wilderness, until December 25th, it's believed Jason was, by choice, out in the wilderness of the Ruahine mountain range. And so as this huge search is launched for him in the area he is in, it's entirely possible that he either did not see any of the searchers. This is a very rugged and heavily forested area, and so that's not totally outlandish. Or 2, even if he did see the searchers, he may not have recognized that they were looking for him because remember, during that time frame, he didn't think he was in danger. He was out in the wilderness camping by choice. But sometime around December 25th, or maybe a couple of days before, when he needed to leave and go back to Dannevirke to see his family, after packing up his stuff, for whatever reason, he could not get back up to the road where his car was. Either there was some sort of physical boundary, or maybe he got lost, but either way, Instead of going back up the mountain, we know Jason actually turned and began going down the mountain, away from the road and away from his car. It's believed Jason actually just decided he would hike his way out of the mountains. He was in great shape, very healthy guy, and he probably figured he could just hike the 8 miles to Dannevirke, and then he could have someone drive him back up and retrieve his car at a later date. But on or around December 30th, Jason was still out in the mountains. And at this point, he had abandoned his backpack and his sleeping bag and had most likely removed his shoes and socks for reasons we don't know. But he had managed to get much closer to Dannevirke. He just had to navigate a few more steep sections and then he'd be home free. And so on or around December 30th, Jason began slowly making his way down the mountainside until he reached a decision point. He found himself standing at the top of 2 very steep gullies that both would bring him down to a dry stretch of riverbed, and so either option worked. It just became a matter of which one is safer. And so after making his assessment about which gully he should take, he made his choice and he made his way down and he reached the dry riverbed. And it was at this point that Jason would have begun to feel a pain in his stomach. And that pain would have gotten worse and worse and worse to the point where Jason likely sat down on this dry riverbed, kind of waiting for the pain to subside, but it wouldn't. It would only intensify. And so as he's sitting there kind of wondering what's going on, his vision would begin to blur, and then he would start to struggle breathing. And before he could deal with all of these strange symptoms that were coming on really suddenly, he lost the ability to move his body and he slumped over onto his left side, and there he would lay until he died. It would turn out the gully that Jason had chosen to go down when he was standing at the top and he had those 2 choices, the one he chose, that one contained a plant called Urtica ferox. This plant, which is endemic to New Zealand, grows leaves that are covered in little rigid stinging hairs that contain a toxin called trifidin. And trifidin, in high enough doses, not only causes stomach pain and blurred vision and trouble breathing, but it also causes total body paralysis and even death. Jason, who according to friends would have known about the dangers this plant posed, likely just didn't see the cluster of plants when he was assessing which gully to go down. And so it wasn't until he was partway down the gully and was in these plants that he realized his mistake. But when he turned to go back up, it was just too steep. And so he was forced to trudge through these toxic plants. And because he was wearing shorts, his lower legs were exposed and they were stung repeatedly. And so he was dealt a lethal dose. The reason the pathologist was not able to identify this as Jason's cause of death is because the stingers on those plants, they don't leave any marks on the human body. And its poison, trifidin, is so rare that when they sent out that toxicology report, they didn't include it. They did not test for trifidin. And so it wasn't until 15 years later when the pathologist's colleague heard that Jason had been found in the Ruahine Mountains that the colleague said, wait a minute, have you checked for trifidin? Because he knew the Ruahine Mountains were home to clusters of that toxic plant. And so sure enough, they went back to where Jason's body had been found, and lining the gully that he had come down were dozens and dozens of those plants. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the 5-star review button needs a pair of socks, offer to loan them a pair of yours. But make sure they're the kind of socks that immediately slip down under your heel into the shoe as soon as you start walking. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on Amazon Music, because starting November 1st of this year, 2022, our podcast is only going to be available on Amazon Music. However, from now until November 1st, you can still get the podcast on all platforms: YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, everywhere. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the Mr. Ballin Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the Mr. Ballin Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and